The storage and disposal of hazardous materials can be a serious threat to the environment. The proper storage and disposal of hazardous material is also a critical safety and health problem that continues to endanger human and animal life. The definition of a hazardous material will vary somewhat, depending on what standards, laws, or regulations you are referring to or dealing with. But for our purposes, let's define hazardous materials as substances that are toxic, flammable, or corrosive. These substances are capable of causing fires, explosions, and pollution of air, water, and land. Because of the seriousness of related safety and health hazards associated with hazardous waste operations, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, has issued a standard specifically developed to protect employees in this type of environment. The standard covers workers employed in cleanup operations at uncontrolled hazardous waste sites, waste treatment facilities, storage and disposal facilities, and workers responding to emergencies involving hazardous materials. This course will discuss OSHA's requirements for hazardous materials and hazardous waste operations, the requirements for emergency response at uncontrolled hazardous work sites and treatment, storage and disposal or TSD facilities, and the steps an employer must take to protect the health and safety of employees in these environments. An effective and comprehensive safety and health program is essential to reducing work-related injuries and illnesses and to maintaining a safe and healthy work environment. Therefore, the standard requires every employer to develop and implement a written safety and health program that identifies, evaluates, and controls safety and health hazards. Additionally, it contains emergency response procedures for each hazardous worksite or TSD facility. This written program must include specific and detailed information on topics such as organizational work plan, site evaluation and control, site-specific programs, information and training programs, personal protective equipment or PPE programs, monitoring surveillance programs, decontamination procedures, and emergency response programs. The written safety and health program must be periodically updated and made available to all affected employees, contractors, and subcontractors. The employer also must inform contractors and subcontractors or their representatives of any identifiable safety and health hazards or potential fire or explosion hazards before they enter the worksite. Planning is the key element in a hazardous waste control program. Proper planning will greatly reduce worker hazards at waste sites. A work plan should support the overall objectives of the control program and provide procedures for implementation. It should also incorporate the employer's standard operating procedures for safety and health. Establishing a chain of command will specify employer and employee responsibilities in enforcing and carrying out the safety and health program points. A good work plan includes supervisor and employee responsibilities along with the means of communication. It should include the name of the individual who supervises all of the hazardous waste operations and the site supervisor who is responsible for implementing the site's safety and health program. The plan should define the tasks and objectives of site operation as well as the logistics and resources required to fulfill these tasks. These tasks can include anticipated cleanup and/or operating procedures, definitions of work tasks and objectives, methods of accomplishing the tasks, the established personal requirements for implementing the plan, and the procedures for implementing training, informal programs, and medical surveillance. Necessary coordination between the general program and site-specific activities should also be included. Site evaluation, both initial and periodic, is critical to the safety and health of employees. Site evaluation provides employers with the information needed to identify site hazards. This way, they can determine the proper protection methods for employees. OSHA requires that a qualified individual conduct a preliminary evaluation of an uncontrolled hazardous waste site before entering the site. The evaluation must include all suspected conditions that are considered to be an immediate danger to life and health. These conditions include confined space entries, potentially explosive or flammable situations, and visible vapor clouds. It is always a good practice to conduct a site re-evaluation periodically. This way, employers can be certain of the conditions of the TSD facilities because the conditions and/or operations can change. The ability to control the activities of employees and how equipment is moved is also integrated into the evaluation and control process. This is a very important part of the safety and health program. Whenever there is an effective management and control of a site, the potential for employee exposure to contamination is minimized and the public is protected from hazards and vandalism. When implementing a site control program, it is important to use a site map, site work zones, site communication, safe work practices, and the name, location, and phone number of the nearest medical facility for medical assistance. The use of a buddy system is required as a protective measure to assist in the rescue of an employee who becomes unconscious, trapped, or seriously disabled on site. In the buddy system, two employees must watch each other carefully and only one should be in a specific, dangerous location at a time, so that if one gets in trouble, the second can call for help. A site-specific safety and health plan is an additional safety program designed to complement any other safety plan already being implemented. It is designed to help in the elimination or control of any anticipated safety and health hazards. The site-specific plan must include all of the basic information and requirements of the overall safety and health program, while addressing the unique characteristics of a given site. To give a scenario, the site-specific plan may outline procedures that address confined space entries, air and personal monitoring, and environmental sampling. This also includes a spill containment program to address the particular hazardous materials present on the site. It is the responsibility of the employer and safety managers to inform employees of all hazards present on the worksite. Pre-entry briefings must be held before employees are allowed to enter a site. Employees must be made aware of the details of the site safety and health plan and its applications. Employers must also have scheduled safety and health inspections to rectify any existing deficiencies prior to initiating work on the site. At each worksite, the employer must institute any feasible engineering controls and work practices that help reduce and maintain employee exposure at or below permissible exposure limits. Examples of engineering controls include the use of pressurized cabs or control booths on equipment and remotely operated materials handling equipment. Examples of good work practices include removing all non-essential employees from potential exposure while opening drums, wetting down dusty operations, and placing employees upwind of potential hazards. OSHA requires the employer to develop a written PPE program for all employees involved in hazardous waste operations. The program is part of the site-specific safety and health program. This program must include an explanation of each piece of equipment selected and its use, maintenance, storage, decontamination and disposal, proper fit training, donning and doffing procedures, in-use monitoring, program evaluation, and limitations. Employers are responsible for providing employees with PPE. Determining the proper PPE is very task-specific. For instance, an employer may provide the employee with a self-contained breathing apparatus, a positive pressure air line respirator equipped with an escape air supply, or with totally encapsulating chemical protective suits. Let's see how much you've been paying attention. In preventing injury from hazardous materials, the tasks and objectives of site operation, as well as the logistics and resources to fulfill the tasks, must be identified in which of the following? Is it A, work plan, B, site evaluation program, C, site-specific safety and health program, or D, PPE program? The correct answer is A, work plan. Work plans support the overall objectives of the control program and provide procedures for implementation. A good work plan includes supervisor and employee responsibilities along with a means of communication. The plan should define the tasks and objectives of site operation, as well as the logistics and resources required to fulfill these tasks. Site evaluation provides employers with the information needed to identify site hazards in order to determine the proper protection methods for employees. A site-specific plan includes all of the basic information and requirements of the overall safety and health program, while addressing the unique characteristics of a given site. It is designed to help in the elimination or control of any anticipated safety and health hazards at specific sites. PPE programs explain each piece of protective equipment that employees must wear to prevent injury from hazardous materials or conditions. Airborne contaminants can present a significant threat to employee safety and health, thus making air monitoring an important part of an effective safety and health program. The employer must conduct monitoring before site entry at uncontrolled hazardous waste sites to identify conditions that are in the immediate danger to life and health, such as oxygen-deficient atmospheres and areas where toxic substance exposures are above permissible limits. Accurate information on the identification and quantification of airborne contaminants is useful because it helps to determine the type of PPE required. It also helps to delineate areas where protection and controls are needed, while assessing the potential health effects of exposure and the need for specific medical monitoring. After a hazardous waste cleanup operation begins, the employer must periodically monitor those employees who are likely to have higher exposures to determine if they have been exposed to hazardous substances beyond permissible exposure limits. The employer must also monitor for any potential condition that is within the immediate danger to life and health range, or for higher exposures that may occur as the result of new operations in the workplace. Drums and containers can present potential hazards to the safety and health of employees. Before handling a drum or container, the employer must assure that drums or containers meet the required OSHA, Environmental Protection Agency, and Department of Transportation regulations. Damaged drums or containers must be emptied of their contents and properly discarded with a device classified for the material being transferred. In situations where a spill, leak, or rupture occurs, the employer must provide employees with salvage drums or containers, a suitable quantity of absorbent material, and approved fire extinguishing equipment in case a small fire occurs. Employers must train employees to be able to identify and interpret hazard labels or safety placards. In addition, employers must explain to employees how to remove soil or coverings and the dangers of handling unlabeled drums or containers without knowing their contents. Employers should encourage the moving of drums be kept to a minimum and isolate hazardous materials being transferred into drums or containers. If drums or continuous containers bulge, swell, or show crystalline material on the outside, they must not be moved onto or from the site unless appropriate containment procedures have been implemented. All drums or containers must be properly labeled and packaged when shipping to a licensed facility for disposal or storage. Medical surveillance programs help to keep track of health and fitness of employees who work with hazardous materials. The employer must establish a medical surveillance program when all employees exposed or who may be exposed to hazardous materials or other health hazards are at exposure limits for more than 30 days per year. Employers must also establish this program when workers are exposed to unexpected or emergency releases of hazardous wastes above exposure limits without wearing PPE or when signs of illness as a result of exposure to hazardous materials occurs. All medical examinations must be performed under the supervision of a physician at the expense of the employer and without loss of pay. They need to be scheduled in a reasonable time period and place. Examination must include a medical work history, emphasizing any symptomatic patterns related to the specific duty of handling hazardous materials, other on-site health hazards, and fitness for duty. This includes checking employees' ability to wear the required PPE expected for their worksite. The employer must give the physician a copy of the standard regulations relevant to the specific employee's duties, along with all the possible hazardous material exposures. The employer will provide information about the type of PPE that is required for that employee's duties and any prior relevant medical history. The doctor will conduct the examination on the employee and report only on the medical conditions or limitations relevant to the job's possible exposure and the use of a specific PPE. Decontamination procedures are part of the specific safety and health plan and must be communicated to employees and implemented before employees are allowed to go into a worksite with hazardous materials. The safety manager or site safety and health officer will monitor the decontamination of employees, decontamination and disposal of employees' clothing and equipment, as well as the solvents used for decontamination. This is done before any employees leave the work area. In the event that an employee's non-impermeable clothing becomes grossly contaminated with hazardous substances, the clothing must be decontaminated and immediately removed before taking a shower in the designated shower and changing rooms. Employees who are required to shower must be provided showers and change rooms that meet OSHA requirements. Protective clothing must be decontaminated, cleaned, laundered, maintained, or replaced to retain effectiveness. The employer is responsible for informing the launderer of the dangers involved in coming in contact with the clothing and equipment because of the hazardous substances present. Temporary workplaces must also follow standards to ensure that employee exposure to hazardous materials is minimized. Each temporary worksite must have a supply of potable water that is stored in a tightly closed and clearly labeled container equipped with a tap. Disposable cups and a receptacle for cup disposal must be provided. The employer must also clearly mark all water outlets that are unsafe for drinking, washing, or cooking. Temporary work sites must also be equipped with toilet facilities. If there are no sanitary sewers or in close proximity to the hazardous waste site, the employer must provide privies, chemical toilets, recirculating toilets, or combustion toilets. Additionally, washing facilities that are equipped for employees to be able to remove any hazardous substances must be near the worksite and within controlled work zones. The employer must also ensure that food service facilities are licensed. Proper emergency planning and emergency response are important parts of the safety and health program and help to minimize employee exposure and injury. OSHA requires that the employer develop a written emergency response plan to handle any type of possible emergencies before performing hazardous waste operations. The plan must include site topography, layout, prevailing weather conditions, and procedures for communicating incidents to the various levels of government agencies, local, state, and federal. Practice drills should be carried out periodically and amended where it may need to be corrected or improved to correspond to possible site changes. An alarm system must be installed and fully operational to notify employees of emergencies. The plan must be made available for review by employees, OSHA representatives, and other officials with relevant responsibilities. When it is found to be necessary, employees must wear positive pressure self-contained breathing apparatus and approved self-contained compressed air breathing apparatus with cylinders. In addition, backup and first aid support personnel must be available for assistance or rescue. The employer must keep exposure and medical records on file for a minimum of 30 years. Records of employees who have worked for less than 1 year do not have to be kept after employment, but the employer must provide them to the employee at the time of termination. The employer has a duty to inform each employee of existence, location, and availability of these records. If the employer plans to cease doing business and there is no successor employer, the employer must inform the employee of his or her right to access his or her record at least 3 months before the end of doing business. As part of the safety and health program, employers are required to develop and implement a program to inform employees, contractors, and subcontractors performing a trade on a given hazardous operation site. This training must be suited to the same level of task and exposure that respective employees are likely to encounter. Employers are also required to develop and implement procedures for introducing any new technologies that will provide protection for employees while conducting hazardous materials or waste operations. Training provides employees with the information they need to practice good working habits with regards to the type of site and hazardous materials they are likely to be exposed to. Therefore, employers must work with safety managers or safety professionals to develop the proper safety training curriculum for both supervisors and lower level employees so that they are able to recognize hazards and prevent them. This curriculum must teach employees the proper care and use of respirators and other types of PPE, engineering controls in their use, proper decontamination procedures, emergency response plan, medical surveillance requirements, confined space entry procedures, spill containment programs, and any appropriate work practices. Employees must be able to identify their colleagues, supervisors, and alternates in charge of site safety and health. Training requirements will vary based upon the type of hazardous exposure employees will encounter on a given site. Employees must not be allowed to perform any operation involving hazardous material or waste until they have received the proper training at the appropriate level. At the conclusion of the training, employees will receive a letter of certification. This certification must be documented and maintained in the company's records. Every subsequent year, the training must be renewed and recorded as evidence of being up to date. The certificate is transferable in the event that an employee goes to work at another site. However, there may be a need to go through a new training based upon the type of hazardous site the employees will be working. All right, let's see how much of this you retained. Which of the following statements about medical surveillance programs is true? A. Employers must establish medical surveillance programs when employees are exposed to hazards at exposure limits for more than 20 days a year. B. Employees must establish medical surveillance programs when workers are exposed to unexpected releases of hazardous wastes above exposure limits while wearing PPE. C. All medical examinations must be performed under the supervision of a physician at the expense of the employee. Or D. The employer must give the physician a copy of the standard regulations relevant to each employee's possible hazardous material exposures. The correct answer is D. The employer must give the physician a copy of the standard regulations relevant to each employee's possible hazardous material exposures. This assists the physician's examination. Examination must include a medical work history emphasizing any symptomatic patterns related to the specific duty of handling hazardous materials, other on-site health hazards, and fitness for duty. A is incorrect. Employers must establish medical surveillance programs when employees are exposed to hazards at exposure limits for more than 30 days. B is also incorrect. Employees must establish medical surveillance programs when workers are exposed to unexpected releases of hazardous wastes above exposure limits without wearing PPE. Finally, selection C is incorrect in placing the cost of medical examinations on the employee. Instead, these should be paid for by the employer. When not handled properly, hazardous materials can pose a serious risk to life and health. OSHA recognizes the need to improve the quality of the hazardous waste work environment and has issued a specific standard for it. This standard provides employers and employees with the proper information and necessary training to enhance workplace safety and health. This will result in great reduction in the number of injuries and illnesses resulting from exposure to hazardous materials.